Hey, Mike here. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Dark Poutine early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Welcome back to Dark Poutine. I'm Mike Brown.
And I'm Matthew Stockton.
Yes, you are. We're here again doing another show, and what's interesting is this show, we're not really sure if what we're talking about actually happened, so it's a legend this time.
First of all, thank you. I like the old ones, the legend ones, because we can have some fun with them.
Right.
And I love a good yarn.
Yeah, a good yarn is kind of fun.
It's a sad story, but it's a good yarn, I think.
It's a good yarn. Yeah. Yeah, there's some real craziness that goes on around this one that may or may not have happened. So let's dig in.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during the Dark Poutine podcast are solely those of the producer and do not necessarily represent those of Curious Cast, its affiliate, Global News, nor their parent company, Chorus Entertainment.
Dark Poutine is not for the faint of heart or squeamish. Listener discretion is strongly advised. We're not experts on the topics we present, nor are we journalists. We're two ordinary Canadian schmucks chatting about crime and the dark side of history. Let's get to it. Put on your toque, grab yourself a double-double and a Nanaimo bar. It's time to scarf down some Dark Poutine.
You are responsible for obtaining and maintaining at your own cost all equipment needed to listen to Dark Poutine. Dark Poutine can be addictive. Side effects may include, but not be limited to, pausing and questioning the system, elevated heart rate, pondering humanity, odd looks from colleagues as you laugh out loud at work, family members not into true crime worrying about you. Positive side effects may include some perspectives and opinions that you disagree with, as well as some wokeness and empathy. If you don't think Dark Poutine is for you, consult your doctor immediately.
Snow piles against the old roadhouse at 108 Mile in BC's interior in the mid-1800s. A weary miner steps inside, gold dust sewn into his clothes. He's looking for a hot meal and a bed. Behind the counter, Agnus McVee, the innkeeper, watches him closely. By morning, he will be gone. And as the story goes, so will his gold. For more than a century, locals in British Columbia's Cariboo region have whispered about Agnes, the innkeeper who drugged and murdered travelers, burned their bodies in her hearth, and kept young women in chains in the cellar. Some call her one of Canada's first serial killers. Others say she never existed at all. In this episode of Dark Poutine, we untangle the chilling legend of Agnus McVee, the supposed crimes, the shocking discoveries, and the uncomfortable truth that the documents we'd expect to prove her guilt are missing. Was Agnes a real killer, a convenient villain for a brutal frontier, or something in between? You're listening to Dark Poutine, episode 410, The Legend of Agnus McVee, Murder at 108 Mile. In the early 1860s, British Columbia's remote, forested interior suddenly became the focus of the world's attention because of gold. The Cariboo Gold Rush pulled in thousands of prospectors from across North America, Europe, and China, all chasing stories of easy riches in creeks like Williams, Keithley, and Antler. Most didn't strike it rich, but kept coming anyway. following rumors, newspaper reports, and letters home that described fortunes made overnight. To reach those gold fields, you had to travel inland from the coast along a route that was dangerous and slow. In response, colonial authorities pushed through the Cariboo Wagon Road, a roughly 650-kilometer route from Yale up through the Fraser Canyon and into the Cariboo. It cut through steep canyons, hugged river cliffs, and crossed rough bridges, but it turned weeks of brutal travel into a more predictable journey for packers, freight wagons, and stagecoaches. Along that road, everything the miners needed moved in: food, tools, mail, booze, and every miner's hope was that what they brought out would take the form of gold. Because the road was so hard and the distances between established towns were long, a chain of mile houses sprang up along the way. Each one took its name from its distance along the route from a starting point like Lillooet or Yale, places like 70 Mile House, 100 Mile House, and 108 Mile House. These weren't just cozy inns, they were rough roadhouses that offered hot meals, a bunk in a crowded room or on the floor, stables for animals, and often a bar and gambling. In many of them, sex work operated openly or semi-openly, and the line between hospitality and exploitation could be thin. With so much gold and alcohol in circulation, robbery, assault, and occasional murder were part of the risk. 108 Mile House sat in the upland country of the interior plateau, far from the busiest mining towns, but right on the crucial flow of traffic heading toward Barkerville and the surrounding creeks. It was the kind of stop where a prospector might arrive half frozen, exhausted, and carrying all his wealth on his person. Nights could be quiet except for the wind and the sounds from the roadhouse, but the stakes were high. People, pack trains, and coaches carrying gold all passed through this lonely waypoint. In a landscape like that, if someone disappeared between 1 mile house and the next, the road itself, or the people who ran those stops, often took the blame. Agnus McVee was already in trouble by the time she reached 108 Mile. According to the legend, she came from Scotland, a woman with a history of violence hanging over her, including claims of multiple beatings and murders back home. Some versions describe her as striking and blue-eyed, others as large and physically strong, the kind of woman who could hoist a 400-pound grain sack on her own. Whether she was beautiful, intimidating, or both, the key detail that keeps repeating is that Agnus is in charge. She dominates the people around her long before anyone starts talking about bodies in the bush. The legend places Agnus at the 108 Mile Hotel from about 1875 to 1885, right on the Cariboo Wagon Road during the tail end of the gold rush. She doesn't run the place alone. Her husband, Jim McVee, is described as a devoted workhorse, doing the chores and tending to the endless practical jobs that keep a roadhouse running. Then there is Al Riley, said to be her son-in-law, a muscular, younger man who tends bar and takes care of the rougher side of things. In most tellings, both men answer to Agnus. She is the one making business decisions, giving orders, and turning the roadhouse from a marginal business into something darker. On paper, the 108 Mile Hotel is just another stopping place along the road. Food, liquor, a place to sleep, maybe a girl if you have the money. It is a 3-story inn in some accounts with stables, storage, and cramped sleeping quarters for travelers and workers. But this is not Barkerville with its crowds and watchful eyes. 108 Mile sits in open country, a bit off the main centers, and the traffic that comes through it is patchy. Freight wagons, packers, gamblers, and lone miners with everything they own in a few bags. That isolation is part of what makes the place work, and what, in the story, makes it dangerous. If someone vanishes between one stop and the next, there are ravines, rivers, and weather to blame. Very few people would think to look hard at a single roadhouse.
This is the moment where folklore smells opportunity, Mike.
Right.
I love the mythology of these old stories.
Mm-hmm.
Frontier space does something interesting to the imagination, doesn't it?
Sure.
When there are no witnesses, no paperwork, no police patrol driving by every hour, the mind fills in the gaps.
Right.
So the isolation of these sort of frontier towns didn't just allow crime, it actually help to manufacture myth.
Right?
The road becomes a character, the wilderness becomes an accomplice, and a lonely roadhouse, that's narrative gold.
There you go. Yep. Agnus leaned into that isolation, at least as the legend tells it. The hotel's reputation is for cheap girls and liquor, a place where men going to or from the goldfields can drink, gamble, and buy company without many questions asked. Young women, often described as runaways or looking for work, pass through the area hoping to latch onto a rich husband or find employment in the booming north. Agnus is said to offer them jobs, and if they refuse or try to leave, the story claims she has other methods. Ropes hidden under her skirts, a cellar or an attic where the girls can be chained until they are broken in and ready to be sold or rented out. Whether or not that ever happened, it sets up a picture of a roadhouse where the usual power imbalance between travelers and staff is turned on its head by one person. In this version of events, Jim and Al are not the masterminds. Jim might grumble or drink too much. Al might be quick with his fists, but both are portrayed as instruments of Agnes's will. She's the one who, according to some sources, has already escaped justice once in Scotland and now sees the Cariboo as a place where authorities are thin on the ground and record-keeping is spotty. The Cariboo Wagon Road delivers a steady stream of men with gold and no family nearby, and Agnus knows it. She runs the hotel as a legitimate business on the surface. Meals are served, beds rented, whiskey poured. Underneath, the legend paints her as quietly assessing who has money, who is traveling alone, and who might not be missed if they never make it to the next stop. Descriptions of Agnus are blunt. The 108-mile heritage site material and local retellings describe her as large and very strong, and emphasize how she had complete control over her household and staff. Old country rumors of previous murders paint a picture of her not as someone corrupted by the harsh frontier, but as a predator who found the perfect environment in which to operate. In these stories, she is cold, calculating, and patient, someone who can pour a drink, offer a smile, and at the same time be deciding whether the man across the table is going to leave 108 Mile alive. All of this is still before the first killing in the tale. The stage is set with a dangerous woman, a compliant husband, a brutal son-in-law, and a roadhouse on a lonely stretch of road where money and people pass through, and sometimes don't come out the other side. From the mid-1870s into the 1880s, prospectors, gamblers, and packers are said to have arrived at the 108-mile hotel with gold in their pockets and never been seen again. These men had often spent months or years in the Cariboo working remote claims and carrying their wealth with them in the form of dust, nuggets, or coin. When they stopped at Agnes's roadhouse, they were hungry, tired, and usually traveling alone. According to local retellings, that combination made them ideal targets. They checked in, paid for a bed, ordered drinks, and then simply vanished. Accounts from the Cariboo Gold Rush website and regional heritage groups describe a specific scheme that Agnus, Jim McVee, and Al Riley allegedly repeated over and over. A man with obvious money would arrive, flash his gold at the bar or in a card game, and draw Agnes's attention. Once she had marked him, the hotel's hospitality turned deadly. Some versions say his drink was laced with a drug or poison, leaving him unconscious or severely weakened. Others describe him being shot or bludgeoned once he was alone in his room or lured outside. Either way, the end result is the same in the story. Jim or Al would dispose of the body, the hotel would hold on to the gold, and the man's absence would be written off as just another disappearance on a dangerous road. The geography of the Cariboo Wagon Road helped cover this up, at least as the legend tells it. The terrain between mile houses is rough, and in the 19th century only lightly monitored. When a prospector failed to arrive at a planned destination, people could blame the weather, robbery, or an accident on the trail. The 108-mile hotel sat in the middle of this landscape, and it was easy for Agnus and her accomplices, on paper at least, to shrug and say a guest had left at dawn and never come back. The Cariboo Calling column, drawing on the 108-mile heritage site, claims the trio may have carried out this kind of attack on as many as 50 men, killing them for gold, burying it around the ranch, and scattering their remains in lakes and shallow graves. One of the clearest fictionalized examples of this pattern is the story of Henry Dawson. The Cariboo Gold Rush site describes him as a prosperous miner who arrived at the hotel with around $11,000 worth of gold, a life-changing sum. He booked a room, ate a meal, settled in, but never made it out. In that version, he is murdered for his wealth, his body dumped in a nearby lake, and his disappearance initially chalked up as yet another unsolved killing along the road. Only later, when items such as his inscribed pocket watch supposedly turn up at the hotel, does suspicion circle back to 108 Mile. Whether Dawson himself ever existed as described is doubtful, but his story captures the core accusation. Men with gold went into Agnes's orbit and didn't emerge. Poison plays a central role in many retellings. The idea is that Agnus preferred quiet methods when she could manage it. Rather than relying on Jim's gun or Al's fists, she is said to have slipped substances into drinks or food to knock the victims out or kill them without a struggle. The Cariboo Gold Rush narrative about Jim McDonald, for example, has Agnus calmly cooking her husband breakfast after learning he has murdered a gambler and taken his money, then poisoning him so efficiently that he dies writhing on the floor. In that scene, she uses poison as a tool of control and cleanup, removing a liability within her own operation. The same sources imply that miners may have died the same way, served a final meal or a drink by an innkeeper who already knew they would not live to see the morning. Disappearances were easy to explain away, which is part of why this story works so well as folklore. If a man left the hotel late, drunk and alone, and never reached the next stop, people would assume he'd been robbed on the road, attacked by animals, or simply succumbed to the elements. There were no phones, no GPS, and often no close family in the region to raise the alarm quickly. In that context, Agnus and her family could supposedly keep killing without drawing immediate attention. Bodies dragged to lakes or ravines at night, the hotel swept clean by morning, and no direct witnesses prepared to speak up. Over time, the story shifts from isolated killings to something much bigger. The Post-House article and related materials claim that when authorities finally investigate, they uncover multiple murders. They allegedly searched lakes north of the hotel and found up to 49 male bodies and skeletons, none of them ever positively identified. Other sources echo that scale in broad strokes, speaking of dozens of dead miners and travelers whose remains were pulled from water or found near 108 Mile. It's a staggering number, and it is one reason modern historians are skeptical, but within the legend, it underlines just how extensive the killings are supposed to have been. The pattern of violence is not limited to men. A key and very disturbing strand of the Agnus McVee story involves these young women we mentioned earlier. The Cariboo Gold Rush profile and local columns describe girls and young women traveling north during the gold rush, often on their own, hoping to find work, support their families, or marry a well-off miner. According to these accounts, Agnus watched for them just as carefully as she watched for rich guests. If a young woman accepted a job at the hotel and then refused to work the way Agnus demanded, or if she declined Agnes's offer outright, things could turn ugly very fast. The legend says that Agnus kept lengths of rope hidden under her skirts ready to use if a girl tried to leave. Some versions place the captives in the hotel's basement, others in the attic, but the image is consistent. Several girls chained together in the dark, half-starved, beaten into submission, and punished if they resisted. The Find Out How Agnus McVee Was Caught story describes police officers entering the hotel and discovering 8 young girls in chains, terrified and unwilling at first to talk about what had been done to them. Their stories eventually line up. They had been abducted or trapped by false promises, held prisoner, and then sold or rented out to men with money. Writers describe these transactions bluntly as white slavery, using the language of the time. The 108-mile heritage site material summarized in Cariboo Calling says Agnus loaned or sold the girls to prospectors, gamblers, and anyone else with cash and loose morals, turning them into commodities rather than employees or even human beings. One YouTube narrator, drawing on the same story, talks about girls chained in a basement and sold to men as wives or camp followers. Waymarking and tour content repeats that Agnus kidnapped young women heading for the goldfields and sold them either for a night or for a longer term as cooks and partners in remote camps. These details are lurid and unverified, but they have become central to how the legend is told. A combination of these two schemes, killing men for their gold and trafficking women for profit, is what has made Agnus McVee such a prominent figure in local lore. On one side are the miners, arriving flush with success and leaving as unclaimed remains in lakes and ashes, and on the other hand are the girls drawn north by hope and held in chains in an attic or cellar, punished and sold until an opportunity to escape appears. In both cases, the 100-mile hotel is presented as a trap disguised as a refuge, and Agnus is the person who designed it that way. After the break, we'll get into the moment that supposedly brings it all crashing down. The girl who gets away, the first whispers to authorities, and the search of the hotel that, according to the story, uncovers a nightmare in the Cariboo. We'll be right back. And we are back at the halfway point, Matthew.
Yeah, you know what interests me about this story? It tells us more about the storytellers than Agnus McVee.
Right?
Yeah. It's, frontiers are chaotic and people disappear and violence happens and records are thin and that's all real stuff. But we are generally, as humans, are uncomfortable with chaos. So these stories, as they age, we compress things into a singular villain. Right? Instead of saying that the gold rush was brutal and lawless, we manufacture potentially that there is a monster at 108 Mile, because it's cleaner and it gives randomness, sort of this mastermind, right?
Right.
And I find it fascinating that we by making that mastermind a powerful woman, the poisoner, the madam, the one in control, it fits a very old pattern.
Okay.
Even if Agnus never existed, the conditions that make her believable absolutely did. And maybe the real question isn't whether she's real, it's why people shape a villain this way that makes it seem so plausible,
Right, yeah, pretty fascinating story, this one. After harrowing tales of men vanishing from the 108-mile hotel and girls being kept in chains, the legend says that a young woman finally escaped and shared her experience with the law. In some tellings, she is simply the girl who had been sold like property. In others, she's a frightened teenager about 17, bought by a gambler named MacDonald for a shocking sum and dragged away into the night. Either way, she is the one person who both escapes Agnes's control and lives long enough to tell the tale. The setup for this turning point starts with MacDonald's arrival at the roadhouse. The Cariboo Gold Rush account describes him as, quote, a young, strapping, blonde-haired gambler coming from Fort Langley carrying plenty of money and a gambler's charm. As usual, Agnus and her crew prepare to rob and kill him. Jim hitches what the story calls the death wagon, and Al Riley waits outside with a rifle expecting the signal to shoot their guest and claim his gold. At the last moment, Agnus changes the plan. She decides she wants MacDonald alive, not dead, because he has come to buy a girl. No, she reportedly tells Al when he expects the order to fire, he's come to buy a girl and girls I have for sale. The girl in question is described as a very beautiful 17-year-old who has been held prisoner among the other captives at the hotel. Agnus agrees to sell her to MacDonald for $4,000, a huge sum at the time. MacDonald pays, ties the girl to one of his horses, and rides off down the Cariboo Wagon Road, unaware that the hotel is not finished with him yet. Later that night, Jim McVee leaves the hotel alone. When he returns, Al Riley discovers that he's hunted MacDonald down, shot him dead, and taken his money. about $8,000 in gold coins, according to the story. Jim has essentially run the standard McVee scam behind his wife's back, killing the gambler Agnus wanted to keep. The betrayal is what triggers the chain of events that ends the operation. When Jim comes back, Agnus confronts him and gets the truth out of him. McDonald is dead, the gold is now in Jim's hands, and the girl is somewhere on the road with no protection. The next morning, the legend has Agnus appearing to forgive him. She cooks him a hearty breakfast and sits nearby while he eats. Then he collapses, thrashing on the floor in violent convulsions and dying soon after. Agnus has laced his food with poison, calmly removing her husband as a liability and taking control again. She and Al then start planning how to get rid of Jim's body, treating him the way they have allegedly treated so many others. The mistake they make is forgetting about the girl. Jim, focused on killing McDonald, stealing his gold, leaves her alone on the trail. Different sources handle this slightly differently. Some say she manages to wriggle free from her restraints and stumble down the road on her own. Others simply say law enforcement officers of the Northwest Mounted Police encounter a terrified young woman walking along the Cariboo Wagon Road, clearly traumatized. Either way, she is in bad shape when they find her, hungry, shaken, and reluctant at first to talk. Once she feels safe enough, she tells them a story that sends them straight to 108 Mile. She explains that she had been held prisoner at the hotel with several other girls, all chained together and fed daily by a man named Jim. She tells the officers that McDonald had bought her from Agnus for $4,000, tied her to his horse, and started south, only for the man named Jim to catch up, shoot McDonald, and take his money. The officers now have a dead gambler, an escaped captive, and a name. They ride on to the hotel and see if what she says is true. The search that follows is one of the most gruesome parts of the legend. Law enforcement arrives at 108 Mile Hotel, according to the Cariboo Gold Rush and Caribou Calling accounts, catches Agnus and Al as they are preparing to load Jim's body onto a wagon. The girl identifies Jim's corpse as the man who shot McDonald, confirming at least part of her story. The officers then begin to search the property. In the hotel itself, they head upstairs and into hidden spaces where they claim to find 8 young girls all chained together, half-starved and terrified. It takes time to persuade them to talk, but when they do, their stories match. They had been captured or lured there, kept in chains, beaten into obedience, and either sold to men or prepared to be sold.
Yeah, and here's where we move into very familiar moral architecture, right? The chain girls in the attic, the evil madam, the secret rooms. It's powerful imagery. It's also like a recurring cultural template. We see in it Victorian panic literature of early 20th century white slavery campaigns.
Sure. Yeah.
And we see it again in modern trafficking.
Taken by the quote-unquote savages and sold into white slavery. Yeah.
Right. And it's not to say this stuff doesn't happen, right? Because there's lots of cases still going on about this stuff. But it doesn't mean that exploitation never happened at the frontier. It absolutely did. But when a story arrives fully formed this way with every symbolic ingredient, I start asking whether we're hearing a story or just an archetype,
Yeah. Yep.
Or history or an archetype, yeah.
Carl Jung would have some interesting things to say about this story, I think.
Absolutely.
The officers did not stop at rescuing the girls. There were rumors of other, darker things happening at the hotel. They sifted through fireplaces in the hotel, digging through ashes and debris. In those ashes, according to the story, they found fragments of human bones, burned remains from previous victims disposed of in the easiest place to hide them, the hearth. They also searched rooms and hidey holes and in some versions found items that tied the hotel to earlier disappearances. The Caribou Calling piece mentions McDonald's stolen money, evidence of burned remains, and a watch belonging to miner Henry Dawson turning up at the hotel. Those details, if true, would link the McVees not only to recent disappearances and murders, but to a pattern of killings that go back years. Hidden gold is another major element officers say they uncovered. By the time the law stepped in, estimates in the legend claim Agnus had stolen around $150,000 in gold from murdered miners and travelers, hiding the wealth around 108 Mile Ranch. Some caches were allegedly found by ranchers in the 1920s and again in the 1960s during airstrip construction, keeping the story alive. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, though, the focus is on what can be directly proved: the chain girls, the burned bones, and the stolen property linking the hotel to named victims. Once the officers have their evidence, they arrest Agnus McVee and Al Riley. Jim, of course, is already dead from the poison Agnus slipped into his breakfast. The surviving girls accuse both Agnus and Al of holding them prisoner and selling them against their will, and they place Jim as the one who brought them food while they were chained up. The authorities remove Agnus and Al from 108 Mile and take them to Fort Kamloops, a major regional center for policing and courts at the time. There, they are formally charged with kidnapping and murder, based on the rescued girls' testimony and the physical evidence at the scene. From Kamloops, the pair are transferred to the New Westminster Jail to await trial. It is at this point that the legend gives Agnus one last act. She does not stand in court to face a judge and jury. Instead, she somehow manages to keep or acquire poison while in custody and uses it to take her own life in June of 1885. The accounts do not agree on exactly how she pulled this off, but the implication is that she outwitted the system one more time, avoiding a public reckoning for the murders and trafficking she was accused of. Her death is described as a deliberate act, a final decision made on her terms.
And of course she does.
Right.
Because legends rarely allow villains to stand trial.
Mm-hmm.
Trials produce paperwork, and
right.
Paperwork produces facts, and facts are boring.
Facts are really boring sometimes, yep.
And a dramatic suicide keeps the myth intact. It preserves the mystery, and it avoids cross-examination.
Mm-hmm.
The villain exists on her own terms, and the story avoids the full administrative afterlife, if you will, of a real criminal case. And narratively, that's elegant. Historically, it's convenient. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, it's a fascinating story, and I love how, I don't want any of these bad things to have actually happened to anyone, right? Mm-hmm. But it's just such a good story. It's almost folklore tradition in Canada telling these stories,
Mm-hmm. Yep, you can picture this story being told around a campfire of some description by, some grizzled old folk fella with a cigarette in his mouth and a beer in his hand. Anyway, as the story goes, Al Riley does not escape in the same way. To avoid the harshest penalty, he cooperated with the authorities, providing them with information about the crimes and the locations where some of the gold had been hidden. According to the Cariboo Calling piece, he hoped for leniency by helping investigators build the case against the McVee operation. It didn't work. He was ultimately found guilty and hanged, the story placing his execution in 1895. That left him as the only one of the group to be formally punished in a courtroom sense, with Jim dead by poisoning and Agnus dead by her own hand. One reason this story hits so hard is the claimed body count. Different tellings give different numbers, and they are high. The Cariboo Calling column, drawing on heritage materials, mentions up to 50 missing men whose bodies or bones are supposedly found in lakes, fireplaces, and shallow graves near the hotel. The Post House piece repeats the claim that 49 male corpses are recovered from lakes north of 108 Mile, none of them identified by name. Other sources stay vague, speaking only of dozens of murdered miners and travelers. Over time, these figures have shifted in retellings, sometimes growing, sometimes rounding off, and what they share is a sense of scale that moves Agnus from individual killer to near mythical predator.
Yeah, and so let's say 49 people, right? 49.
That's a lot of folks.
Right. And that's the point where my historian brain leans back and folds its arms. 19th century British Columbia was not a paperwork utopia.
No, it definitely wasn't.
49 bodies pulled from lakes? That's not a small oversight.
It would have showed up in a few places, I think.
Yeah, it's a logistical event. And you do not quietly recover 50 skeletons and leave
that would have made the paper.
Administrative trace, right?
Right.
No, almost 50 people, no coroner's reports, no sensational headlines, no political noise. And I think when numbers get...
But it's the frontier, Matthew. It's the frontier.
And, and when numbers get round and dramatic, folklore is usually driving the wagon.
Yeah, true. After the supposed arrests and deaths, the 108-mile hotel itself started to slip from active business into local lore. Heritage sources say the original roadhouse was abandoned not long after, its dark reputation making it hard to run as a normal inn. Later, structures on the property change owners and uses, but the site keeps its association with murder and mayhem, as one Williams Lake Tribune piece puts it. Modern visitors hear stories of ghostly activity at 108 Mile, strange noises, uneasy feelings, a sense of being watched, told on ghost walks and in Facebook posts that connect the current buildings to the McVee legend. The place becomes not just a point on the old Cariboo Wagon Road, but a stage for a story that mixes crime, haunting, and frontier hardship. Up to now, we've been walking through the story as it has been told on local columns, heritage sites, and tourism material. Now we have to ask, what can actually be proven? Researchers and local historians who have sought hard evidence about Agnus McVee have tried to track down the kinds of records you would expect in a case this serious. They've searched for court documents in Kamloops and New Westminster, looking for indictments, trial transcripts, or sentencing records that mention Agnus, Jim, or Al. They have checked jail registers and intake logs for a woman by that name dying in custody in June 1885. They've looked for coroner's reports that might list unidentified bodies recovered from lakes near 108 Mile in the late 19th century. Beyond formal justice records, people have also dug through newspapers at the time, especially in New West, Victoria, and the Cariboo region communities. A case involving dozens of murdered miners, a string of trafficked girls, and a woman serial killer hanged or dead by suicide would have been prime material for the press. Yet those searches have not turned up clear coverage of an Agnus McVee or a McVee trial. There are no headlines about a sensational hotel murder case, no obituaries marking a mass grave discovery at 108 Mile. Land records examined in 108 Mile also failed to turn up documentation tying a McVee family to ownership of any hotel during the dates given. Again, what turns up is fuzzy at best and often completely absent.
Yeah, and this is where the temperature changes, because the absence of evidence is not proof of innocence, but the absence of everything is telling.
Yeah.
No trial transcripts, no jail log, no coroner's ledger, no land record. If this happened at the scale described, it would have rippled outward in ink somehow. Right? Instead, the story appears decades later, fully dressed as if it was sort of like waiting backstage, you know what I mean? And, that doesn't kill the legend for me at all, but it moves it firmly into the realm of storytelling.
The story of Agnus McVee makes for a chilling tale of the Cariboo Gold Rush. A murderous hotel keeper, dozens of victims, a lonely roadhouse along a dangerous road. But when historians and researchers try to match legend with official records, the story begins to unravel. Most modern summaries describe Agnus McVee as a legendary or fabled 19th century serial killer, and researchers have repeatedly pointed out that the evidence for her crimes is extremely thin. There are no confirmed trial records, no authenticated jail logs, no coroner's reports that document the recovery of dozens of bodies tied to a local hotel keeper at 108 Mile. Even writers who retell the story for local audiences acknowledge the same problem. The key details cannot be verified in surviving archives. Once you start looking closely, specific inconsistencies appear. One problem is the dates. In the legend, Agnus supposedly dies by poisoning in June of 1885. Her partner, Al Riley, is said to have been executed about a decade later, around 1895. Yet those dates do not line up neatly with documented executions or in-custody deaths in British Columbia under those names. Typically, if an execution was to happen in the late 1800s in Canada, it would happen weeks or at the very most months after the sentence, not a decade. Another issue is the victims. The stories include vivid characters, travelers, gamblers, and miners with names like Henry Dawson or just MacDonald. They arrive at the roadhouse, disappear, and later their bodies are supposedly found nearby. But researchers who have searched newspapers, death records, and coroner's files have not been able to match those names with confirmed deaths that fit the circumstances of the legend. Then there's the most dramatic claim of all, the discovery of 49 bodies in lakes or other places near 108 Mile. It is the kind of revelation that would have stunned the province. There are no solid contemporary reports in newspapers describing such a massive recovery effort. No government documents, no headlines announcing the discovery. So if records do not support the story, where did it all come from? Tracing the legend forward through time provides a clue. The story of Agnus McVee does not appear clearly in 19th century newspapers or in official reports. Instead, it begins showing up much later in regional books and historical collections published in the late 20th century. From there, it moves into early internet sources such as the Cariboo Gold Rush website in the late 1990s. After that, the story spreads further. It appears in local history columns, ghost tour scripts, and online waymarking entries. Each retelling adds a little more color. Dialogue, exact amounts of stolen gold, dramatic scenes of bodies being discovered, yet many of those versions can be traced back to a relatively small cluster of modern sources repeating the same core narrative. Tourism and storytelling have clearly played a role in keeping the legend alive. Today, the Gold Rush Trail is promoted as a historic driving route through central British Columbia. Stories of danger, crime, and mystery help bring that landscape to life for visitors. A murderous hotel at 108 Mile with hidden rooms, buried gold, and travelers who never returned makes for a compelling stop along the road. There's also a certain regional pride wrapped up with the tale. A notorious villain, even a possibly fictional one, gives the Cariboo a dark story that stands apart from more familiar pioneer hardships. Tours, interpretive displays, and online posts sometimes lean into that drama, blurring the line between this is what the legend says and this is what actually happened. Over time, the story has also absorbed familiar elements from popular crime narratives. The calculating poisoner, the secret rooms, H.H. Holmes comes to mind, the dozens of unidentified victims, and the references to white slavery. The image of the evil madam, an older woman exploiting younger women, also echoes a long-standing cultural stereotype. Historians who study frontier communities often point out that sex work in roadhouses and mining camps was complicated and loosely organized rather than controlled by a single villainous figure. Even so, the legend has continued to grow. In recent years, the story reached a wider audience through Agnus Murderous, a graphic novel by Canadian author Sarah Lillooet. Lillooet has been open about the fact that she was inspired by the legend rather than attempting to write a factual biography. Her book takes the outline of a woman accused of terrible crimes in a rough colonial setting and builds a fictional inner life around it. In interviews, Lillooet explained that the story interested her precisely because of its uncertainty. The Agnus in her book is shaped by trauma and violence, a morally complex figure whose life unfolds in the harsh conditions of colonial frontier society. Coverage of the book reflects that same understanding. CBC Books, for example, describes Agnus as a fabled 19th century serial killer, noting the lack of firm documentation behind the legend. Critics often focus on how the story explores themes of colonialism, gender, and isolation rather than trying to provide whether the historical Agnus ever existed. At the same time, works like the graphic novel have introduced the story to new audiences who may encounter Agnus McVee for the very first time as if she were a real historical figure. In that way, modern retellings can make the legend feel more concrete, even as they acknowledge its uncertain origins. Outside of the books, the story continues to circulate online. Blog posts, YouTube videos, ghost tour scripts, podcasts repeat the tale of the murderous hotel keeper. Some present it almost entirely as fact. Others add a careful qualifier, calling her legendary or supposed. The result is a patchwork of versions, some confident, some cautious, that leaves many readers unsure where the truth ends and folklore begins. That uncertainty raises an important question. How do you tell a story that is powerful and deeply rooted in a local identity when the evidence beneath it is so thin? One approach is simple honesty, to explain clearly what can be documented and what belongs to legend. That distinction matters because the real history of the Cariboo during the gold rush was filled with violence that often went unrecorded. Indigenous people, Chinese laborers, and women working on the margins of frontier communities often died without their stories being carefully documented and later told. They're lost to history. Focusing too tightly on a possible fictional serial killer can overshadow these very real histories. Yet the persistence of the Agnus McVee legend also tells us something about how people understand the past. There is, of course, the simple appeal of a gruesome mystery. Images like dozens of bodies in a lake or girls chained in hidden rooms are hard to forget, whether the evidence behind them is strong or shaky. Today, if you drive through the South Cariboo, 108 Mile House is a quiet stop along Highway 97. The area features ranch land, restored heritage buildings, and interpretive displays about life during the gold rush. Visitors can walk through the 108-mile heritage site, sometimes hearing whispers of the old legend as they explore the grounds. The place itself feels calm and open, but the story laid over it remains dark. Agnus McVee, as she exists in legend, may be more myth than history. The world that made the story believable, the rough conditions of the gold rush, the violence tied to a colonial expansion, and the vulnerability of people traveling through remote country was very real. This leaves a final question. What is more unsettling? The possibility that a woman like Agnus McVee truly ran a death trap along the Cariboo Road? Or the possibility that no such woman ever existed, and the story feels entirely plausible? So not to put you on the spot, but okay, we're done the episode. So how do you feel about this one, Matthew? What was did you groove on it a bit, or?
I found, I like the older ones. They're a little bit of breath of fresh air in a weird way, because it's so unclear. And I think this is more of a folklore story, maybe based on one person doing something bad to one person, right? But got blown out of proportion. And I think it's like I said earlier in the show, I think it's a way of telling the horrors of the time, but encapsulating it into a neat story with a villain and with all of the characters that are needed.
I mean, how many times is that done on TV and film now?
Yeah. And we didn't have TV and film back then, so we made up these stories.
Yep. I like to do folklore every now and again, but I don't want to make a habit of it because we do tend to tell the truth.
But no, I honestly, especially after last week, I needed this one. So
yeah, last week peed you right off. You were just so upset.
Well, usually they do. Often I'm peeved off at most of the stories we have to tell. But sometimes I just have a little bit more energy to express my peevedness than others.
I gotcha. Well, that makes sense. Anyway, that is it for this episode of 410 of Dark Poutine and the legend of Agnus McVee, Murder at 108 Mile. That's right. It's time for voicemails. You can leave us a message at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see who called us this week. We had a voicemail from River who called back after last week to correct herself. During that show, she misnamed somebody who was a victim of crime. If you listened to the last episode, you heard that. But I corrected it in real time, so we don't have to play that voicemail from River.
River had a brain fart like we all do.
River, it's okay. People have brain farts all the time. I conflate one thing with the other all day, every day. Yeah. So.
And I loved how she's like, I somehow said the name of the person I'm pet sitting for.
Yeah.
That's something, River, that is so something I would do.
It is so something both of us would do. So do not feel badly, River. I could hear it in your voice. I didn't want to play the voicemail because you sounded so plaintive and contrite. You don't need to feel bad. You just don't. Anyway, here's our voicemail.
Hi there, it's Melissa calling from Saskatoon. It's been a while since I left a voicemail, and so I just wanted to say hi. And I noticed something listening back to the old episodes. There is such a difference between your former co-hosts and Matthew. Matthew, you are phenomenal. Your insights leave me shocked sometimes. And you may have seen that I've actually quoted some of what you said on the Dark Poutine Lumberyard page because it's just so profound. Mike, you could not have found a better co-host for your show. Anyways, guys, take care and go take a shit in your hat. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. And everybody brings something different to the table, and Matthew's insights I knew would be valuable to the show, so that's why he's here. Anyway. Yeah, I appreciate you too, Matthew. You know that. I hope you know that.
I do.
Okay, you took a long time to answer me there. So.
Oh, no, I just somehow got on to when she's talking about Saskatoon. I started looking at the religious breakdown of Saskatoon from the 2021
interesting.
census.
Well, I was going to ask you what Melissa does there in Saskatoon.
So I think she's a theologist.
Okay.
So 51% Christian, 37.8% irreligion. I don't know what irreligion is.
Mm-hmm. Like not religious.
Oh, okay. Islam 5, Hindu 2, Sikh 1.2, Buddhist 0.7. There's 1,935 Buddhists living in Saskatoon, which is
wow.
Fun. Indigenous spirituality 0.6, Judaism 0.2, and other.
So that's what Melissa's doing. She's studying all that stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's interesting.
And she also runs the Joni Mitchell fan club.
Of course, because theology and Joni Mitchell fan club go together like
Joni Mitchell
cheese and chips.
Is a goddess, and her music is heavenly. So there you go.
Oh, there you go. Okay, fair enough.
Are you a Joni Mitchell fan? You better not say that you're not.
Of course I'm a Joni Mitchell fan.
She's great.
They paved paradise and put up a parking lot, Matthew. Anyway, that's it for this week's voicemails. Again, you can leave us one at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you, even if it is just to say hi and to tell us to go shit in our hats. If you're stumped for what to chat with us about, a quick story is welcome. We don't have any donut money donors or PayPal folks this week, but that's okay. We know you still love us. Thanks to all our patrons and donut money donors past and present for your generosity. It helps to keep the show going. You can become a patron of Dark Poutine at patreon.com/darkpoutine. For a one-time donation, you can send us donut money via PayPal or interact using our email address, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already subscribe to the show, it would mean a lot if you did. You can easily find Dark Poutine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. If you haven't gotten yours yet, my 2 books are available to order via links on the Dark Poutine website or anywhere fine books are sold. And speaking of darkpoutine.com, check it out for show notes and other cool stuff. We'd appreciate it if you gave Dark Poutine a like or a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Most importantly, thank you for listening. Tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is a powerful thing. And that is it for this episode of Dark Poutine. So until next time, don't forget to be a good egg and not a bad apple.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.